Welcome everyone, Shalom, Shalom. Thank you for joining us here at Beit Avichai. The subject that I've chosen for this short series of talks is Torah as Poetry, ? The energy behind that title comes from a verse in the Torah. Right at the end of Sefer Dvarim, at the end of the book of Deuteronomy, the last commandment that God gives Moshe, actually, goes like this: write for yourselves this song. Kitvu lachem hashira hazot. And teach it to the people and place it in their mouths. Right? Now, the question is, what is the song? The simplest answer is to say it's the song that comes immediately after that place at the end of the Torah, which is Parshat Ha'azinu, which is a song. Once you say that, you have no more problems. But the interesting thing is that the Chachamim, the sages, actually, in framing a law that declares that every person has to write a whole Sefer Torah for himself, quotes this verse, as if to say this song refers not to a particular song, but to the whole Torah. In other words, the whole Torah, prose and all, and legal passages. We're going to be giving it a thorough testing this week, because the parsha we begin with is our parsha, which has to do with law. How can one in any way find a poetical element, right? I'm being very cautious, in the text of this legal parsha, which has to do with laws almost from start to finish. There is one final chapter that is not all laws. But that's going to be our material now. The question is, what do you think poetry is? What demand does it make on the reader? It's obvious that the Torah is not written in poetical form. Parallelisms, saying one thing and then deepening it, intensifying it in the second half. The whole Torah is not written like that. So we have to look for a less formal idea. What is it to call the whole Torah poetry? Poetry song, it's the same word. Emily Dickinson had quite a rigorous criterion for poetry, and I can't resist starting with this, because of course Emily Dickinson will never say the expected thing. She says, if I read a book and it makes my whole body so cold no fire can ever warm me, I know that is poetry. If I feel physically as if the top of my head were taken off, I know that is poetry. These are the only ways I know it. Is there any other way? So here is Emily Dickinson being at her most baffling and provocative and sharp. She is really talking about the poem as something that does a kind of violence to you. It breaks into you in some way. It isn't just something pretty that you can read with flowers and sunbeams and so on. That's not the definition of poetry for her. For her, it has to do with the sheer physical impact of the poem. And any kind of text, strictly speaking, could have that kind of impact, a kind of sharpness of impact that affects one like a wound. I'll read Kafka now, in rather a different mode, but interesting to compare. He says, any book, a book that's worth reading, otherwise why would you read it, must be the axe for the frozen sea inside us. That is, we as readers come to receive, I can say it in a very grandiose way, come to receive some kind of revelation from a real book or from a real poem, right? Of course, each one has a different subject there. So, focusing on the poetry aspect, Emily Dickinson is here requiring something of the reader, not only of the poem. She's requiring of the reader a kind of readiness to feel that impact of the text. If I close in now on our parsha, Ele HaMishpatim, these are the laws that you shall place before the children of Israel. That is God speaking to Moses, Hashem to Moshe, after the great parsha of Yitro has given us the 10 commandments and some supplementary commandments. And suddenly it's as if we're onto something else. We'd have to do it with a series of laws, but they also were given at Sinai. So 2 things were given at Sinai. There was the 10 commandments, etc. And then there was this week's parsha, which is also given at Sinai. So we have a kind of binary situation now. On one hand that, on the other hand this. Have a look at number 1 on your page. Midrash Rabbah on this opening. The Ele HaMishpatim, these are the laws. What is written before this parsha, this section? V'shaftu et ha'am b'chol et. They shall judge the people at all times. Now that is quoted from the story of Yitro, who advises Moshe how to deal with all the legal problems that he is facing, and so that there should be legal services available, judicial services available for even the poor who can't afford to wait around all day for the judges to arrive. It should be available b'chol et. And our Midrash now says, aha, you see, even before Matan Torah, there was law, because Yitro was advising, presumably before Matan Torah, although that's not unequivocal. He was advising about the execution of law. So that shows you that before this legal parsha, there already was a section that had to do with laws. Ve'amar ve'ele hamishpatim. And then there was our chapter, our parsha of these are the laws. V'hadibrot ba'emtza. And the 10 commandments are in between. So we have suddenly a kind of slightly piquant structure. There were laws before the 10 commandments. There are laws after the 10 commandments. Now, why is that significant? The 10 commandments, hadibrot, are in the middle. They are the heart of the matter. But they are flanked on either side by legal sections, before and after. What is this like? This is like a fine lady who is out walking, and she has armed men on this side of her and on that side of her, and she is in the middle. Now, what an idiom, what a metaphor there. The 10 commandments are like an aristocratic lady who is very delicate and very exquisite, and the more delicate and exquisite she is, the more she needs protection. Why? Because this is Olam Hazeh. Because we're dealing with this world. And fine ladies don't go out in this world without proper protection. Hazayin mikan, v'hazayin mikan. Laws on either side, and the metaphor is arms on either side. And as you may know, the word zayin is a highly gendered word. It's a word that means it's the masculine, right? It's the phallic symbol, yes? Masculine equipment, military equipment, zayin. And so what you have is a highly gendered situation as well. The feminine in the middle and two armed bands protecting. Dinin lifaneha v'dinin achareha. Laws before and laws after. So suddenly we think of law as having really a violent aspect. It's not that just that law comes to deal with violence in the world, but law itself has to be violent in order to deal with it, in order to protect the lady, yes? Now, in this case now, suddenly we have the beginnings of a poem in the Midrash. Right? This is the Midrash. It's not hard to find poetry in Midrash. It's almost a commonplace. But notice what it does to you. It makes you uneasy. You know, laws are violent. You know, I don't know if I like that. I tend to think of laws as the proper constitution of society. It regulates the energies in society. It all has to do with calm judicial decisions made by judges, and you know, in normal legal situations. But this Midrash is not going to accept that, and continues and says, and that's why it says, and then there's a quotation from Proverbs, I shall walk in the path of righteousness. And then the Torah says, now the Dibrot, the 10 Commandments, are now just called Torah. Torah says, on which path shall I walk? And the answer is, I shall walk b'darkan shel osei tzedakah. I shall walk in the paths of those who do righteousness. Right? Somehow amplifying the pasuk from Mishlei, the verse from Mishlei, to talk now about the habits of people who are righteous people. And in the midst of on either side are netzivot mishpat, are the legal paths, Torah ba'emtza, and the Torah is in the middle. And the dinin before and afterwards, and we have another example of how there were laws beforehand, and then, of course, the laws afterwards. So you have a structure here. Our exquisite lady, who is the Ten Commandments, and even pushing it further, the Torah itself, is now separated from the legal apparatus. Torah and Mishpatim become, as it were, two separate things. Now, everyone knows that's not so. Mishpatim are an important part of law, are an important part of Torah. Torah includes everything. But from this perspective, and it's a challenging perspective, it wants you to think of certain things. One of the things I think, obviously, it wants you to think of is the violence of the law. And by the violence of the law, when I speak about that, I have in mind a very powerful article by Robert Cover, who was one of the leading legal thinkers in America, in the generation just before us. And he has, among other brilliant essays, he has an essay called Violence and the Word. And he asks the question there, what is it that the judge does? The judge who legislates and then who has to decide, who has to adjudicate. He has to go on the evidence to decide what shall be the verdict in this particular case. And he's arguing against the idea that that is an ivory tower event, the making of laws and the application of laws, as if that's just for the academics. You know, there you are in your universities and in your law departments, creating law and applying it to the particular case. He says no, and he uses very, again, very, very vivid language. He says legal interpretation takes place in a field of pain and death. It couldn't be much stronger than that. The language itself is a kind of blow. Again, I want to say. Legal interpretation takes place in a field of pain and death. Bodies are at stake. When the judge declares his judgment, someone is going to lose either his life or his property or his freedom. Right? That bodies are going to pay the price of this. And he has many things to say about the way that the academic framing of law is implicated, deeply and inextricably implicated in the real world and the real world of violence. It's not a fine lady. It's here things get blurred. Here the academic and the judicial couldn't happen unless they were protected by the officers at the door. The criminals were intimidated, right? The accused was intimidated by the police who fill the court, who keep the court safe. And the judge knows very well that what he is doing is condemning the person, the accused, to either this or that. In other words, this is, when he talks about pain and death, and he simply says that the creation of law, the interpretation of law, places bodies on the line. Pain is what we're talking about here. Violence and pain to those who are suspected of committing violence, if you want to say it like that. And so we justify it, of course, and we say, you know, we need violence to protect the fine flower of civilization. We need violence to protect everything that's dear to us against the violent people out there. And that, we'd like to think, represents a kind of common normative aim. That's something that we all want. We all share that ideal. And Robert Cover says again in his very shrewd way and a very humanistic way, he says, no, the accused doesn't in any way share the assumptions of the judge. The accused has a very different sensibility and a very different attitude to what is happening to him. You're talking about two different worlds here. The world of violence, this time exerted by the judge, and the world of the vulnerable body, right, that's going to be subject to this violence. Without the support of this violence, I say it again, the judge couldn't do what he does, and law and order couldn't be sustained. So there's a kind of balance of terror here. We want terror controlled, we want violence controlled, but on the other hand, we are committing violence against the person, physically speaking, against the person who is on trial. And then he says, since he's put this in such very vivid and compassionate words, he says, and please don't get me wrong, I wouldn't have it any other way. You know, and it comes across as a little bit ironical. You know, he means it, but he's slightly ironical as well. There's an anarchist strain in him. And he has been called the anarchist who loves law. Sorry, yes, the anarchist who loves law. It's a contradiction in term. That is, he loves the law, but he has a very keen sense of what the law does, and he doesn't mince his words about it. He says, but I wouldn't have it any other way. In other words, I'm completely on your side, dear normative reader, you know, who wants civilization to. Yeah. So that's this very intriguing position that he takes, and I wanted to explore it a bit. Yes. Since we live in an unredeemed reality, we need to do all kinds of maybe not ideal things. Yeah, it's a necessity. You want to protect the lady, then you better have your weapons on the draw. Robert Cover gives us a kind of slightly double feeling about it. You know, a certain feeling that he's for it, and nevertheless he is very sensitive to the issues at stake. So we're talking here about a field of violence, and that makes me think of the field of violence from which Bnei Israel have just emerged. They've just emerged from the land of Egypt, from Mitzrayim, Mitzarim, which is the place of pressures of all kinds. Mitzar, lochatzimotam. The Egyptians put pressure on them constantly, even when they weren't out and out hitting them and smiting them and killing them. What were they doing to Bnei Israel? They had them surrounded in a culture of fear, in a culture of anxiety and potential pain always. And that was the atmosphere of Mitzrayim. Into this atmosphere, Moshe enters. He goes out of the palace, which is the aristocratic center of that Egyptian culture, where he was pretty protected. He didn't see the guards outside. And he went out to see their sufferings, to look at his brothers and to see their sufferings. And that's his first direct exposure to the violence of the Egyptians against the Israelites. He has an interest in seeing that, obviously. He makes a decision to leave the palace and go and see that. So what then happens? He sees an Egyptian smiting, makeh. Now that's the operative word here. Makeh, nogef, magefot, right? On both sides of the game now. He sees the Egyptian smiting the Israelite. And what does he do? He smites vayach, the same word. Doesn't say he killed, but exactly the same word, which means ultimately killing, but it has that just as a sense of a large-scale violence, you know, just to hit someone else. And so that's what he does to the Mitzri, to the Egyptian. Next day he comes out and he sees two Israelites fighting each other. And he asks one of them, who he thinks is the guilty one, Lama takeh et reacha? Why are you hitting? In other words, Moshe is extremely agitated when the violence seems to have infiltrated into his own people. Yeah, now we are hitting. Yeah? And that becomes a moot question in the Midrash. After all, surely he was justified in killing the malevolent Egyptian But now when he sees that his own people are engaged in some kind of, then he doesn't like it. And the guilty person answers him, look who's talking. Mi samchash sar v'shofet. Who has placed you a judge over us? A judge and a court official over us. Meaning, why are you suddenly getting so violent? You know, to kill the Egyptian yesterday and now to tell us off, to tell me off for starting off this new court. So you can see that it's a very fraught field and that Moshe is driven to use violence against violence. It's an automatic response. And there is one midrash, in any case, that questions that act of Moshe. You know, that from a certain point of view, why did Moshe have to do that? Why did he have to retaliate exactly with the same violence that was being done to his people? And so what we have then is makot. God is now part of the action, and he also starts being makeh everybody, the Egyptians. You know, so that violence is now a divine resource as well. That's what God is doing. Magefot, all these words of bodily violence. I'm not suggesting we be bleeding hearts for the Egyptians, but I just want to notice the language, that the culture of Egypt is in some way picked up by Moshe, it's picked up by God, as if that's the only way to protect life, and in fact to proclaim the value of life. It's ironic when people say sometimes that the legal system exists in order to promote the value of human life. If someone takes a life, then we have to do something about it. But the irony is, of course, that in order to promote that value, you have to take that life. You take the life of the... Now, there is a kind of conscious violence, a conscious irony, it seems to me, about all this. The Torah is not an anarchistic document, obviously, and yet somewhere through this use of language, the makeh theme, right, we're led somewhere to be a little disturbed, a little uneasy. In the end, it becomes a mitzvah to tell the story of Yetziat Mitzrayim. Sipur Yetziat Mitzrayim. It's one of the major mitzvot of the Torah, on the Seder night and every day, to tell the story. Telling the story of getting out of that place, Yetziat Mitzrayim, of emerging from that field of violence. What was involved in that? What was the story there? And here you have a serious emphasis on story, not poetry, just a book. Let's say it's a book that tells a story. I want to suggest that the difference between that kind of literary form and poetry isn't absolute. There are overlaps. There's such a thing as a poetical story, a story that wants in some way to wound and stab. Some way it wants to... What do we have then? Who is the first person to tell the story of Yetziat Mitzrayim in the Torah? Right. That's actually. I did my preparation, so I can answer my own question. It's Moshe to Yitro. When Yitro comes to greet him, to meet him when he's running to Midian. No, when he's returning to Egypt, I'm sorry. Then we read, Vayisaper Moshe. Yeah? Moshe tells a story to Yitro about everything that God had done for them, the whole adventure story, the whole suspenseful story of the Exodus. That's Vayisaper. Have a look at your source page, and you can see Rashi. Vayichad Yitro. Yitro heard the story and he rejoiced. Now that's a very satisfactory response to a good story. A story about salvation, and so unequivocally Yitro is thrilled when he hears about the destruction of the Egyptians and the victory of the Israelites, of God leading the Israelites. Vayismach Yitro, that's the pshat, right? That's the plain meaning of the text. On the other hand, the midrash, right? This is for me it's an unforgettable midrash. Midrash Agada. Na'aseh b'saro chidudin chidudin. His flesh broke out in goosebumps. Chad. Chad is sharp, prickles. His skin is a physiological, neurological response to a story. Goosebumps. And that in the Midrash, in this poetic way of reading, becomes the meaning of vayichad. Chad doesn't just mean he rejoiced. It means also something that has to do with sharpness, right? With being pierced, being penetrated in some way. What is it? And then we learn from this how to behave in the world. That when you're talking to a ger, you shouldn't say anything against his people for 10 generations in the future. In other words, that a ger is very sensitive, will always be sensitive, even if he has crossed over and he has become converted. He will be sensitive to any attack on his own origins. And that's what we understand from this, that Yitro has a serious ambivalence. Now, the story arouses in him ambivalence. On the one hand, joy for what he's opted for the people he's chosen, for the spirituality that he's chosen, everything that he has consciously taken on. And at the same time, some visceral, right, anguish. Meitzar, he is Meitzar al Avedat Mitzrayim. He is troubled by the loss of the Egyptians. So Meitzar means to be troubled, to be under pressure, right? It's an Egyptian feeling he has at that point. He has a visceral sense. And I want to suggest, perhaps without sufficient justification, but it convinces me, that stories have that effect. A good story will not just simply lead to a happy ending and have you feeling just wonderful. That a good story has you prickling on one level or another, either because of the suspense of the story, where you're taken through a lot of emotional suffering in the course of or more importantly, if the story itself gets at you in a way that is unexpected. It arouses unexpected ambivalence in you. And suddenly it's as if something has come out of the story and pierced you. Right? I want to try to make sense of this. In our parsha at the end, we have another sipur. Vayisaper Moshe et kol divrei Hashem ve'et kol hamishpatim, in the last chapter, where we read that he narrates to the people all the words of God, maybe the 10 Commandments, and the Mishpatim. So that separates between the two. But more important, how do you tell a story about law? Why do you use the word narrate? Why does the Torah say he narrated to them the laws? Why not just, he told them? Vayaged. Right? What's vayisaper? The Gur Aryeh suggests that it means he told them how serious these laws that in a sense they've always had. They always had to organize their society. Once they left Egypt, right? With Yitro, already there were laws. So there always had to be an organization of society. But only now, Moshe tells them, these laws are serious. They come from God, and they are punishable. They have a price to pay. And that's the sipur. The sipur is about a message around the laws. Right? The message is that this is serious now. I want to suggest something a little different. And that is that the laws themselves cause in the reader some kind of disturbance. On the one hand, on the other hand. On the one hand, we're very happy that they're there. But even there, not necessarily, right? There are many laws. I remember as a child, I don't know if that's any measuring stick, but as a child reading the Hertz Chumash, the translated Chumash in England, and feeling very uneasy as I read some of the laws. I won't go off into a sidetrack there to try to think laws to do with women, a lot of very difficult material. And I'm suggesting that law, the story of law, is what arouses in the reader, what Kafka said, that they wound and stab us. They are like an axe for the frozen sea inside us. It's a kind of benign disturbance. Yeah? The Torah wants to make us uneasy. He wants to make us feel not just completely comfortable, we're being taken care of by an effective armed band. Right? He wants us to have some kind of alternative sensibility. Where does this become really meaningful? I want to look with you now at a particular passage. I can't claim that it's representative, but it certainly opens up our issue here. I'm looking at, if you don't have, I'm looking at chapter 22, verse 20. Straight after a law against idol worship, apparently nothing to do with it. The ger lo toneh, you shall not abuse a stranger, v'lo tilchatzenu, and you shall not put pressure on him. You should not vex him. That's an Egyptian word. That's a word of Egypt. That's what they were doing to us. Ki gerim hayitem be'eretz Mitzrayim. For you were strangers in the land of Egypt. Now, that's the opening move here. Don't be nasty to strangers because you know what it feels like. That you assume that's what it means. Moving on. Kol almana v'yatom lo ta'anun. All widows and orphans you shall not afflict. You should not afflict any widow or orphan. You might ask, should you afflict anybody? Once you use the word la'anot, then I would say I think that everyone should get free passage from being afflicted. No, specifically widows and orphans. And here I will show my hand, and I will say this. So what does Rashi say? What does the Mechilta say? He quotes the Mechilta. He says, why widows particularly, widows and orphans? Shehem tshushe koach. Because they are fragile, they are exhausted simply with living in the world. They have been left defenseless. They've been left without help. And they are fit targets for affliction. And again, it's somewhat ironical. The sense of they're perfect targets. And just because they're perfect targets, because it's so very easy for you to give a widow and an orphan a hard time, it's just mitbakeh, their position almost dictates what you should do to them, viewed from a certain perspective. And it's a perspective that we wouldn't want to think is our perspective. That's bad guys who do that kind of thing, regard widows and orphans as fair prey. But the Torah is talking to us, not to bad guys out there. It's talking lo ta'anun, you plural in this case. Don't do that. Why? Because it's all too probable that you will. Diber hakatuv behoveh. That's the significant phrase in the Midrash. The text is talking about what commonly happens. Hoveh is reality as it is now. The text is not talking about ideal reality or what should be, but it's talking about the way things are. And the way things are, in a way, couldn't be worse. That the weak are not instinctively protected by us, but somewhere instinctively they become prey. Now, are we really that bad? Why? So what is this about you were sojourners, right? What kind of argument is that? I want to read one more verse, verse 22. Im ane ta'aneoto, if you do indeed afflict the stranger, the widows and the orphans, we've moved on to that. Ki im sa'ok yitz'ak elai, if indeed he cries out to me, shamoa eshma tza'akato, I will indeed hear his cry. Now that is a very uneasily connected pasuk. Yeah? If you indeed do afflict him, just said don't do it. But if indeed, emphatic, doubled, ane ta'ane, and if indeed he cries out to me, doubled, tza'ak tza'ok yitzak, elai shamoa eshma, doubled, I will indeed hear his cry. So 3 sets of doubles. If you really do that afflicting, then if he does. So Rashi says, what's the structure here? The structure is, if you do it, if you do afflict him, ... an ellipsis, meaning there is no consequence written in the text. It's as if it's almost a cry of outrage in itself. If you do that, I don't have to tell you what the reaction will be. And then we go on to, in the next part, say, and if he cries out, then that will make it impossible for me to resist hearing him. Right? These intensives, yeah. Sa'ok yitz'ak, shamoa eshma. If that would be, Ramban says, why the double there? And why is the cry so important? Surely it's the misdeed that's important. You know, the fact that you've made him suffer, that's important. What, does he really have to cry in order that God should take it seriously? And everyone deals with this, and Ramban says very powerfully, yes. Yes. What he says is, first of all, about the ger, that the ger is a threat to you. You should know that if you make a ger suffer, then you should know that he is a threat to you, just as in the end you were a menace to the Egyptians. That's the parallel there. That you were sojourners and they made you suffer. And look what happened to them. So what you should be learning at this moment is not empathy. Oh, I was there. And, you know, that would be one reading. That would be the nice reading. That's the one we like to think of. Look at Rashi. Rashi gives us both readings. Number 3. Yes? No, number 4. Number 4. Ki gerim hayitem. You, because you were sojourners. If you abuse him, he can also abuse you. He can turn rough on you, and he can say to you, Af ata megerim bata. You too come from strangers. Mum shebecha al tomar lechavercha. The blemish in you, the defect that you carry in yourself, you shouldn't go around accusing other people or treating other people badly because of it. Because after all, it's throwing, what do you say, people who are in glass houses shouldn't throw stones? You are vulnerable, right? Notice the analogy now. It's not, we were in Egypt and we suffered, and so you should have sympathy for them. That's a different pasuk in the next passage in Rashi. Lo tilchatz, atem yedatem et nefesh hager. That pasuk does mean you know the psychology of a stranger and you know how much they suffer, how vulnerable they are, so don't do it out of empathy. But this Rashi is talking about the violent side of human nature and saying there is something in you that will lead you specifically to attack those who are outsiders and those who are widows and orphans, right? It's counterintuitive on some level because we all think of ourselves as being, you know, our superego is very, very strong. We're very sure we're not like that. But Rashi says, right, over and over again, Diber katuv bahoveh. The text is talking about reality. It's talking about real experience in the world, things that are likely to happen. And that means you. All these laws are addressed to you, which is actually a striking way of framing it. The law could have been addressed to the victim and say, you know, if you are made to suffer and you cry out, then God will listen to you, right? It would have been just as effective. But it wouldn't have had the sting in it. It wouldn't have had that thing that makes us uneasy. If we are the one who is now being warned by the text, don't be like that. Don't be like what? I know I left Ramban hanging there. Ramban goes all the way and he says, there is something to be afraid of from Gerim. Right? You had the power of the powerless, the power of those who have nothing to do but cry out. They only have to have a little peep. That's what the Ramban says. Yes, only the slightest cry. That's the intensification. It's not they have to cry loud. Sa'ok yitzak. It doesn't mean they have to cry loud. Otherwise, God won't hear. On the contrary, the merest cry, and God will react. And so there is that sense, then, of God reacting to the suffering of the other and to the wanton cruelty, in some way, the deliberate cruelty of us. Us. Nice people. Yeah. We are the target of this mitzvah. in the Gemara in Baba Metzia, you have the context for that statement. If you have a defect in yourself, you wouldn't go around pointing it out to other people that they have it and making them feel miserable. And the example is given, a very macabre example, of someone who has, someone had hanged himself in his family. And so that person, that member of the family, won't go around using the word hanging too easily. You know, well, hang that picture. Suddenly we have a sense of how we are affected by language, and language brings memories and brings whole realities in its wake that you might very well have forgotten, right? That you have tried to repress, certainly the reality that you have in you hostile reactions to the weak. That there's a certain hostility that we feel for those who are widows and orphans and strangers and so forth. And that's the nut that we're trying to crack now, that we're trying to understand here. And I want to suggest this, that there is what Erich Sandner calls a kernel of indignity in all of us. That we, all of us, have in us an internal outsider. Contradiction in terms. That there is a part of ourselves, of course, on the surface that's very assured. We belong to the society. We are totally on top of things. You know, everything. You know, I'm a Balabite here. I'm the master of the house here. The more we assert that, the more perhaps we become aware, or might become aware, of something in us that's not at all confident, that has a kind of internal insecurity. And the more we feel that, the more triggered we are by real Gerim out there. Right? Somewhere we want to dissociate ourselves from those who really are weak in society, because we feel in ourselves some kind of vulnerability, some kind of not being the master of the situation. And I know that, I don't know, when I use ideas like this, I know that I'm really relying on your having some kind of resonance with what I'm saying. Maybe you don't, and then I don't know how to prove it. But that there is something in us that is not totally assured. And that's why it's a defensive action when we reject and are rather rough on the weak, as if to say, I have nothing to do with you. You have nothing to do with me. So there's this kernel of indignity. Bnei Yisrael, who stood at Har Sinai, 3 virtues are associated with them. Rachmanim, Baishanim, V'gomlei Chasadim. They are compassionate, they are shamed, Baishanim, subject to busha, subject to embarrassment, to shame. And they do good deeds. All right, I understand 1 and 3. What about busha? That is a criterion of how you know a person stood at Sinai. Right? That's what the Gemara says there. Someone who hasn't got bushet panim particularly, hasn't got a virtue of shamefacedness. It's not the sabra mentality exactly. That's what we rejected when we came to live here, no? But someone who doesn't have that, then we know for sure that his ancestors never stood at Har Sinai. I'm almost embarrassed that this fits so well with what we're saying. It's the Jewish characteristic, and it always was, at least as long as the Galut lasted. It was something we didn't like, it was something we rejected, of course, it made life very difficult, we were subject to humiliation, but it did also include something that's regarded as a Jewish virtue that has to do with a sensitivity to how I'm not playing it well, a sensitivity to a reality that doesn't reflect my highest ideals. Right? So there's some kind of, it's the wound that stabs us again. It's the axe for the frozen sea. We have got very well used to thinking of ourselves as completely ethical, morally justified, and somewhere there is in us a doubt about it, and if we don't have that doubt, and we take defensive measures to prevent ourselves feeling any such doubt, then it's dubious whether we're of Jewish stock, according to that, or at least stood at Sinai, right? That's really more precise. The experience of standing at Sinai, yeah, of course induced. Revelation does that to you. When revelation comes out powerfully from there and comes towards you, it overwhelms you. It makes you feel that you're not totally at home. This is not comfortable. It's not a comfortable situation. This is something coming and piercing you and saying, change something in yourself, or be aware of the potential shame in yourself, which actually is a signal of being a real person. I'm putting it very moralistically. Maybe at this point I want to look at the poem that's right at the end of your page, right at the end of your source page, number 14. This is from a Sanskrit drama, and I found it in a book by David Shulman, who lives here in Jerusalem. Like someone, this is a poem that starts off very suddenly, like someone who, staring at an elephant, insists there is no elephant, who then, as it moves away, feels a certain doubt, and on seeing its footprints, is certain an elephant has been there. Such is the aberrant working of my mind. Right. Quite difficult. I look straight at the elephant, who's right in front of me, and I say there is no elephant. That's the opening move. What leads one not to be able to see reality as it is, as one's living it? Right? It sounds absurd. Well, I can see. My eyes in some way have to be opened to that elephant. Something which is right there in front of me. And that moment would be the moment of becoming a human being. Not taking shelter under unawareness. And what this reminds me of, one of the associations that I have, is a very powerful book by the German writer Christa Wolf. And the book is called Patterns of Childhood. And does anyone know this book? I highly recommend if you're interested in this kind of material. Her parents were passive Nazis. It was the way things were done. And she remembers as a child finding her way somehow down into the Jewish quarter, which went against everything she'd been taught. It was strictly not allowed. The day after Kristallnacht. She's a child, I think she's about 9 years old, and for something draws her to go and see what happened. She leaves the palace and she goes and looks at what happened there. And she says, I must have been quite close actually to the Jewish community there, because I saw them running out of the Beit Knesset, out of the synagogue, trying to save some silver and gold kelim from there. Yeah. And she felt a tremendous, let me quote it, she says she felt great compassion, but it was not a feeling she was supposed to have. She didn't know she was feeling sad. She wasn't supposed to be feeling sad. That is, she felt and didn't feel this compassion because it wasn't part of the map. She had been trained to feel that any movement of compassion immediately changes into anxiety, anger, vengefulness, because you're being got at by those Jews, yet again, in one way or the other. And so here she is, having a feeling that she can barely recognize as the elephant, right? She can't actually, and that is the subject of her whole book. I can't stay with this because we have other things to do, but it's really an extraordinary book about the difficulty she has in beginning to unearth the subject of her rather long book, which is precisely her own childhood, her youth, what she experienced. She can't get at it because it's like the disappeared elephant. It's like the elephant that she knows must be there, but it's simply not there. She can't find it. And it's only on that morning after Kristallnacht that something begins to stir in her. Yeah. And then later events also that bring a reality back that has been well and truly defended against. Yeah, there's no way I'm going to know compassion. Compassion is really a threatening emotion. Now, from here, let's move on to the next source. Actually, where are we? We are at, let's go to number 6. Yes, number 6, the Mechilta. If you indeed afflict him, right? Remember, im aneta anun, him, the widow and the orphan. Rabbi Ishmael and Rabbi Shimon were going towards their own execution in the time of the Romans. And Rabbi Shimon said to Rabbi Ishmael, Rabbi, my heart fails me, libi yotze, she'eni yodeh al ma ani neharag. I don't know what I'm being killed for. In other words, he has this belief in law. He has this belief in meaning. Not the Roman law, but the law of God. He wouldn't be executed if he hadn't done something wrong. That's his assumption. And he is pleading with his colleague, show me what I did wrong. Now, I want to have my eyes opened. And the answer is really quite devastating in its banality. Rabbi Shimon answers, it's apparently a non sequitur. Mi amecha, in all your life, did anyone ever come to you for you to rule on a halachic issue or to ask you a question, and you delayed seeing him just until you finished your cup of coffee or put on your shoe or your talit? You know, you just had to finish getting ready to go and see him. The Torah says, im aneh ta'aneh. If you afflict in any way at all, whether it's a great affliction or a small affliction, if you kept him waiting for 2 seconds while but you demonstrated a certain unconscious powerfulness by taking your time. You know, I need to look proper when I go to see my questioner. Yes, that already is that kind of callousness that we're dealing with. Now, of course, this is a very exaggerated case, but the interesting thing is, I don't know if it's there on your page. Yes, in the English, it's there in the English. The answer that Rabbi Shimon gives him is, you have comforted me, Master, Rabbi. In other words, you have comforted me by making me understand what I did that matches reality. Here, yeah, even if it seems extremely minor. So it's a question of sensibility. We're talking here about a violence that's there in the human sensibility. Right? It's not a stranger to us. We overcome it when we do, and we ignore it sometimes. That is, we're not aware of it. And here, one of the Chachamim makes the other one aware of something, and he's very grateful to have his eyes opened. We move on then to a different. We're talking now about not the violence out there in the world. The law is not intended to deal only with that, but the violence that is in the law and in those who perpetrate the law, those who execute the law. That is, there is something there that needs to be taken into consideration. A few verses later, we have this law. Im chavol tachbol salmat re'echa. If you indeed take as a pledge the garment of your friend, that is, your friend doesn't mean your friend, it means the other person, someone with whom you are in contact. If you take his garment as a pledge against his repayment of a debt, you have loaned him money, and you have very justifiably asked for money, according to the Midrashic Talmudic reading of this, this has not been agreed at the beginning, but only when the debtor has failed to pay his debt on time, the court can impose that the debtor, the debtor leave his garment with the creditor as surety against the payment of the debt. So here you have a situation of law. This is pure law, din, dinhu. This is law. The only way that the creditor can get his money back is if he has the guarantee of the debtor's clothes. Yeah? But here the story is elaborated, and it becomes a story that makes one's skin prickle, and I want to say a form of a poem as well. Ad bo hashemesh teshivenu lo. Until the sun sets, you shall give it back to him. Why? Because it's his night garment. That's the assumption. It's his pajama, let's say. Ki hi ksuto levadahi simlato leoro. For it is his covering. It's his only covering. It is his garment for his skin, right? In other words, he has nothing else between him and the earth. And that's taken as referring not only to clothes, but to the mattress on which he sleeps. He might have given you his mattress in order to... Now, any necessary object, what do you have to do? You, the creditor who wants your money back, quite rightly. Otherwise, you won't lend next time, right? It's many arguments to support the importance of law here, importance of din. You have a right to do this kind of thing, right? It's really, really, absolutely right. And then suddenly this rhetoric of pathos, you might say. But think of this poor man, you know. What you have to do is, before nightfall, you can keep it during the day, but at night you have to give it back to him. He has nothing else for his skin. What are you doing here? Bameh yishkav. In what shall he lie down? Yes. V'hayaki yitzak elai v'shemati. And if he cries to me, I will hear. Well, we've heard that before. Ki chanun ani. For I am gracious. For I am merciful. Chanun v'rachum are synonyms, effectively. Why is that phrase added here when it wasn't added before, when it was a matter of tormenting the widow and the orphan? Yes? That you shouldn't do that. We didn't read there, ki chanun ani, that I will punish you for tormenting in that way, because I am gracious. Right? There is talk about punishment, but not this self-description by God. You know what I am? I have to hear him, because I am merciful. I am rachamim. And the Mechilta, the Midrash on this text, says, ki berachamim barati et olami. What a strange expansion of the canvas. You know, suddenly we're telling a huge story instead of a focused story about a man who has lent money and he wants his money back, and he's perfectly justified in keeping the gage, the what do you call it, the pledge, the mortgage, just at the time when the debtor needs it. You know, what's the use of giving his pajama back during the day and giving it back to the debtor, when, so that he can sleep in it, and then the next day taking, I probably got it mixed up there, but you know what I mean. The idea is, of course, it has to hurt him a little bit in order to be some pressure on him to pay back the money. So that's din. But God says, no, I can't help hearing that cry, because, and I know I said I can't help, but that's really what I feel. All right? God is in some level helpless. Why? Because he is chanun. That's just how he's constituted. Ki berachamim barati et olami. Because the whole creation of my world, insofar as you can call this world my world, olam hazeh as the world of God, it was created out of rachamim. It was God's desire that rachamim be. And so God is here simply, in a sense, it's a moment of revelation. The moment of revelation is the moment of revelation as God as Rachamim. Against Diber HaKatzur B'Hoveh, against the reality argument. How often does God not intervene? Right? I'm sorry to, to say the obvious here. Right? We're very used to that plaint, that God doesn't intervene, and apparently he is capable of hearing the cries, and so on. And here, against that, one of my inspirations for this is James Kugel in his book, The God of Old. It has a wonderful chapter on this. I'm carrying it a little further. That here is God now saying, the nature of me and my world is counterintuitive. It's not what you're used to. You're used to a world, a harsh world, in which you have a right to things, in which din holds sway. I represent something else. Just as at the Yud Gimel Midot in last week's parsha, in next week's parsha, Parshat Kitisa, Perek Lamed Gimel, God will declare himself Chanun V'Rachum as part of the 13 attributes of God, and none of them is love's law. That's not it there. Rachum, V'Chanun. How does that square up with reality? The reality of what God's non-intervention in the world, the reality of this godly world as it is. Somewhere it's as if this is a moment when our eyes are being opened to something that normally we are very used to not seeing. Because this is a hard-edged world. This is a world with very sharp corners. And we don't, in order to live well in this world, normally we need to have claws sharpened and to have awarenesses of the din aspect of things. And as against that, on a certain level, there's this word, Chanun V'Rachum. Not V'Chanoti Asher Achon. Not, I will be gracious to the one whom I will be gracious. Now, once God puts it that way, then we can think, we get out of the difficulty, and we can say, well, God chooses when he's gracious and when he's not. So if we miss sometimes his intervention, it's because he decided not to on this occasion. God is inscrutable. There's inscrutability of God. We can't predict what God will do. But that's a very different sort of thing from the ultimate description that God gives of himself, Rachum V'Chanun. There's something absolute about that. There's no ifs and buts about it. And here is the value of Rachamim now, set up in a very powerful and difficult and painful way. It stabs us in some sense. It stabs us because it doesn't seem realistic in a way. That's part of it. But I think it stabs us for a deeper reason. It's as if we're suddenly, perhaps for a moment, seeing reality in a different light. In a world, not the world that is, but the world that should be, or I don't even necessarily want to say it like that, because that already reduces it. There is an alternative perception of the world. There's not only one way of looking at the world, which is the prudent, cautious, aggressive way. I've got to look after my rights, and so on. That is din. But at the heart of the matter, there is the fine lady. There is the aristocratic lady. And she represents something different. And you could say that she needs protecting by, but God is not limiting himself here. He doesn't say, I need protecting. He says, somewhere that's my strength, that I am Rachum V'Chanun, that I have this. There is in Roland Barthes, the French philosopher, essayist, in his book about photography, there's a book called Camera Lucida. He makes this very strong and provocative distinction. He says, when we look at photographs, we go to an exhibit, and we look at photographs of difficult things in the world, of war and atrocities, and sometimes things that don't seem to be so difficult. He says there are two ways in which you can look. There are two attitudes you can have, two forms of attention. One form he calls studium, a Latin word. Studium And he translates it as meaning, you look at it somewhere as a cultural artifact, which tells you certain things about the world. It brings the, and you interpret it, and you, with a certain calmness, you recognize things in it, and you say, ah, yes, that's what reality is like. And you notice how well or not well the photographer has done it. But that's only part of what can happen when you look at a photograph, using that example. The other thing that can happen, he calls punctum. Punctum, Latin word, for an arrow shooting into you, for a stab, for something coming out of the photograph and penetrating you. It's not you being clever about the photograph. It's not you translating the photograph into words or transforming the photograph. There is something coming out of the photograph, some detail. And he gives examples, actually shows photographs. And what he finds to be such moments of punctuation, puncture, makes a whole. And it's usually very small details that don't quite belong, but are tremendously lifelike. Suddenly we have a feeling, when we look at that there's more to say here than I can entirely contain. That there's something here, there's a revelation being made to me, and I feel uneasy. Where does this leave me? And he doesn't want to say what kind of puncture it is, but it's some mode in which the photograph suddenly becomes a revelation. Not just, well, it's what I more or less knew, but I'm seeing it well represented. It's something new. It's a revelation that comes from another world, in a way. A world of rachamim, or of sensitivity to rachamim. And with this, I think what I'd like to do is to move to the Beit Yaakov, which is the last source on your page. Actually, before we do that, I have one or two sources that come first. Yes. Yes. For instance, Rashi in number 8. This relates to the end of our parsha, where Moshe goes up the mountain again, and he sees God sitting, he has a vision, a machazeh, of God sitting on his throne, and under his feet is k'ma'aseh livnata sapir, like the work of a sapphire brick. That is some kind of worked brick construction, a brick in sapphire. And this is Rashi's comment there. From the Gemara in Sotah. This brick was placed in front of God during the time of the Egyptian slavery. That is, it's as if God deliberately placed that brick under his feet, liskor tzaratan shel Yisrael, to remember the sufferings of the Israelites. That is, God has his own brick under his feet. And it's a precious brick, but it's still a brick. It's a brick of the sufferings of his people, and God doesn't want in any way that his mind should wander from that suffering. He's telling the story. It's there physically, as it were. The metaphor is very strong here. It arouses, as it were, in the divine certain reactions that come from an alerted memory of what was going on down there, how the Egyptians were persecuting the Jews. And also the other function of what was under the throne, uche'etzem hashamayim latohar, like the essence of the heavens for purity. Mishenig'alu haya or v'chedva lefanav. When times changed, when the redemption happened, then there was light and joy in front of him. So you have this very abstract depiction of light and joy. And that is God alerting himself, making himself empathetic with human suffering. It's as if God is here modeling what human beings should do. Right? Everything that's said about God is for us to do, to engage with. It's not the absoluteness of God. Right? We have to look elsewhere to get directly to that. But what it is an indication of the kind of hypersensitivity that God induces in himself. And that is a kind of otherworldly vision. Right? It's a vision that, again, doesn't necessarily correlate with our everyday reality. You know, we're not aware of God being so tuned in to suffering. But it sets up some kind of a larger structure. And then I wanted to look with you also at number 9. Yes, Gemara in Brachot. Rav used to love to say, a favorite saying of his was, or he trained himself to say, perhaps even more powerfully, he trained himself to say this, as if it didn't come quite naturally, but it's something he wanted himself to realize, like that elephant. He said, Lo ka'olam hazeh ha'olam haba. This world is not like the world to come. It's 2 different worlds. There are 2 different realities. What is it about the world to come? It doesn't have eating or drinking or being fruitful and multiplying. It doesn't have business relationships. It doesn't have jealousy, hatred, or competition. So suddenly here you have a whole long list of characteristics of what doesn't exist in Olam Haba. All the aggressiveness of the world. And even the first few terms that you think, well, I quite like my achila v'shtiya, you know, my eating and my drinking and priya v'rivia can be very wonderful, you know, the whole business of having babies and so on. And yet the idea in the end, as you move into the more unequivocally aggressive terms, hatred and jealousy and so on, is that these are all characteristics of this world. And that world is quite different. How is it different? From being far from the opposite of what you experience in this world. So now suddenly we have a kind of polarity here. Everything you know in this world, you should know, is quite strange for you to even imagine, because it's an absence of that in the other world. What are we doing in the other world? Quoting from the end of the Parsha, what were they doing? They saw God, right? Moshe and those who went up the mountain saw God, and they ate and they drank. Which means that they enjoyed the light of God, nehenu miziv hashchina, as if they were eating and drinking. It's not that they were munching sandwiches while they were. That's a possibility that's raised in the Midrash. Are you going to say they really ate? You know what? How vulgar! They see this extraordinary vision and they were eating. No, it means it nourished them. It nourished them, as those who are in the world to come are nourished in that way. They draw in, they nehenim, from the light of God, just as we draw in from. So it's an alternative world. And now the Bet Yaakov, and I've taken off probably more than I can bite here because it's so complex. But I'm going to try to convey something here. We've said that this world has real ugliness in it, has a kind of aggressiveness. And part of what needs to be done about that is acknowledging that that's the case. Seeing it as this world. Seeing it with a certain framework around it. You know, I know this is true, but it's not the whole truth. There's another possible form of attention to things. In Shakespeare's The Tempest, at the end of the play, Prospero, the magician, who has total power over this island, gestures at Caliban, who is this ugly, monstrous monster, creepy, crawly monster, and he says, "This thing of darkness, I acknowledge mine. This thing of darkness, I acknowledge that I made it." In other words, it's part of me. Yeah. And that's really what I'm trying to say. Until we come to the Bet Yaakov, what does the Bet Yaakov have to say? Ele hamishpatim. He says mishpatim represent order, an ordered world. Asher tasim lifnehem, which you shall organize in good order. That is, the thing about laws is that it has to do with organization, structure, things that human beings who are in the body, who are embodied, really need. How are you to do anything if you don't have a certain, as he puts it, hadraga, a certain way of taking things in, processes? You know so much, and then you learn more, and then you learn more. Right? Certain ways in which you can internalize truths or visions. Two different things happened at Sinai, he says. One was, Baboker, and quoting from the Midrash, in the morning the Torah was given. And in the evening, the laws were given. Yeah. It actually says, Biyot HaBoker. When the morning dawned, that's when the Torah. And here you have that distinction again. And this is what he makes of it. He says, in the morning refers to a kind of total revelation. Refers to a totality of love, the experience of love, love of God towards us, love that has to do with our confidence in God's love for us. He makes a point of that we feel a certain deep assuredness when we are in that kind of framework. That was the world of the Ten Commandments. The Ten Commandments basically boil down to Anochi, the one word Anochi. That's the essence of the whole thing. He's not the only one of the Hasidic masters to concentrate it in that way. What is Anochi? Total presence, all-enveloping attention, without any distinctions, no discriminations, no hostilities, no jealousies, no me, if you, then not me, if me, then not you. On the contrary, Halo av echad lekulanu, he quotes from the prophet Malachi, that world of attention knows that, after all, we have one Father for everyone, for the whole world. So why would we? Yeah? But who can live with that in the real world? By the time the night comes, then the light, the intensity of the light has been withdrawn. There has been what's called classically a tzimtzum. There's been an obscuring of the light. They were given that full light. Why? Not because God really wanted to give it to them, according at least to this passage. He did it because the people desired it. Because the people wanted to hear and see the real thing. To see Kvod Hashem. Right? There's a pasuk in Devarim that says that. Har'enu, please let us see. The full rapture. I'm sorry, that's a bad word to choose. The full ecstasy. Let us see the large story, the wide focus gaze, where you take in the essence of things without getting stuck on details. You know, Anton Ernstweig wrote a wonderful book called The Hidden Order of Art, in which he talks about two kinds of attention that the artist pays to the world, or that we pay to the work of art. One is to focus on the details. And it comes easiest. You focus on the details. If it's the ground, it can't be the figure. You want to tell the difference between the ground and the figure, then you can only see one at a time. You know, there's just a line in the middle, and you see this, and that, and then you see that. That kind of focused attention never creates anything. It's the preservation of the world, maybe, at best. It allows violence to be kept under control, things getting messed up and blurred. But in order to create, what one needs is what he calls a kind of wide focus perspective, in which you see impossible complexities all at once. One look at what is at the inner vision of the artist, and he knows already something about all the details. He hasn't got it all worked out yet, but something is there originally. He quotes Wittgenstein, who says that sometimes we know what a word means all in a flash right in the beginning. Let's say it's a new word or a fairly new word, and we get that kind of total grasp of the word right at the beginning. which of course doesn't mean that we'll know all the uses that that word is going to be put to, later, beyond that first vision. But that first vision in some way then filters through, he says. Something of it is left. Something of it, there's a remainder of that first ecstatic total vision of things that allows you to contain enormous complexity in one. You find this certainly in music. How is it that Mozart could write down four-part harmonies that he'd heard once? Obviously not by focusing on this bit and then that bit and this voice and that voice. If you do that, you'll never get anywhere. It was by some kind of total encompassing sense of the reality. And the Brit Yaakov says that's what happened with the Anochi. In fact, it was so encompassing that there was no room, he says, for instance, lo yeh lecha. The first commandment, the Anochi, the full presence, didn't allow for even the idea of other gods. There's no space for it. He says, since the space is full of the light and the love, and of all this, so where would you put that niggling commandment that starts to say no, no? And in the course of this argument, he quotes from, if you have a look at your source page, number 10, just before the Beit Yaakov, Bar Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi. His cheeks are like a bed of spices, quoted from Song of Songs, an erotic context. With every word, with every one of the 10 commandments that came forth from God's mouth, nitmale kol haolam kulo b'samim. The whole world was saturated with spices, with perfume. That is, now we've shifted. It's not only Anochi, but any particular was not just a particular now. It was everything. It contained the heart of the mystery. And in that sense, the world was filled with spices, with perfume. And the question that's then asked, it's a very unexpected question. When the first one of the 10 commandments was given, the world was filled with perfume. Where could the second commandment enter in? In other words, there's no space for anything else. There's no space for multiplicity, you might think. There's no space for complexity and so forth. And the answer that's then given in the Midrash is, God brought forth then a wind from his treasury, and he then caused each one to pass on in order. The wind blew away the first total ecstatic statement and allowed there to be some room for the next one. In other words, what you have is a way of saying that the total ecstatic experience, once given, right, it has to come first. Before you understand any of the details, you have to have some of that. And then in some way the wind wafts it away, but we're talking here about fragrance and not about light. Light, you can say, can disappear. You're left in the darkness of this world. But if you're talking about fragrance, and this really beautiful midrash in that sense, then the idea is that something of the fragrance remains. You can't totally, right? The wind can blow as it likes, but there is something that remains. And that's what Brit Yaakov wants to say, that there is a she'erit. Something is nish'ar from that primary movement of God with the 10 Commandments, in which there is pure rachum v'chanun, you might say. Right? What you have is compassion, and then all the hedgings of compassion, all the details that will qualify compassion and go against compassion, all that is somehow taken into one large vision. That goes. And now with everything that God says, there is sufficient of a large vision to temper the specifics. That is, that there's sufficient, there is sufficient, but when one's dealing with din, with the violence of din, one looks at it in the largest, somewhere with that wide-angled vision, not just with the detailed scrutiny. You know, what is it exactly that I have to do? And in this case, what is it? And what is that? That's part of it, but that is irradiated by the original perfume, by the original light, and there's a sense of how it belongs in an uncopyable picture, you know, because we are not capable of actually drawing that complexity in the world. But there is a sense somewhere of something that still remains, which can make us feel very uncomfortable. You know, once you have that, you know, that obstinate connection with the other world, yeah, with the world of Anochi, Olam Haba, once it infiltrates even very slightly into your this worldly preoccupations, then you are quite uneasy. There's a sense of unease. And it's only gradually that you can come to say, yes, there is an elephant here. That there is something else here which I can barely hold in my mind. I can barely retain in my mind. So in this sense, we've moved very far from law as pure violence. The law of the Torah, the law that guards the lady who is the heart of the mystery, can't be regarded as a pure violence, because it's violence that's already, right, the dinin. The dinin are already part of Torah. The lady affects the laws. The lady affects the harsh bands that surround her. And something of that wholeness is what we should be looking for, perhaps, when we read law. That is, in some sense, not to be totally satisfied with the most hard-edged, detailed, narrow vision of what the law could imply, but to contain somewhere that aura, you know, of the form in which these laws were first given after the original Anochi.